Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. I hope that you're doing well and that you've had a good week. As you know, we are right in the middle of a discussion about democracy, and we began this conversation by sort of taking a look at the historical foundations of democracy and how our understanding of this concept has changed. And remember that we largely focused on this transition from distinguishing between one, few, and many rulers and distinguishing between democracy and dictatorship. And this simple dichotomy is really the main axis when it comes to this debate in its contemporary form. And so we discuss this further by taking a look at the democracy dictatorship measure, which we use as a procedural or minimalist measure of democracy. And we talked about how that relates to Robert Dahl's conceptualization of democracy in the 7 minimum conditions that he envisions as being essential to the concept. So today we're going to continue this discussion, and we're going to continue that by closing up our coverage of the democracy dictatorship measure, and then talking about Polity 4, Freedom House, and then ultimately having a conversation about democratization, democratic transitions, and democratic consolidation. And so we're going to be discussing not just the causes of democratization, but the types of transitions that we've identified, and then the nature of consolidation. And so this conversation has us thinking about democratization as really a 3-step process. There's democratization of the society, the transition itself, and then consolidation. And the measures that we use throughout the process to evaluate how democratic those regimes are or are not. And so we'll get started today by picking up where we left off with democracy dictatorship. And as you'll recall, this measure, it builds on Dahl and his 7 minimum conditions in really 2 ways. So in the first sense, like Dahl, this is a very procedural or minimalist view of democracy. That is to say that this definition and this concept and this measure focus on processes and institutions and structures, not the outcomes produced by those processes. Remember that procedural definitions focus on process and structure and institutions. Substantive definitions focus on the products generated by those regimes, the substantive outcomes, levels of income inequality, levels of participation among different groups in society, these kinds of questions. But the measure also builds on Dahl by focusing on the notion of contestation. And we talked at length about how irreversibility, uncertainty, and repeatability are essential to contestation. But the main difference, and really the most important difference for our purposes, is that democracy dictatorship treats regime type as a dichotomy. So the regime is either a democracy or it's a dictatorship. It's not somewhere in the middle. It's not some shade of democracy or shade of dictatorship. It's simply either a democracy or a dictatorship. That stands in contrast to Dahl, who said that really regime type and democracy are a continuum. That is to say that there are different degrees of democracy, there are different degrees of dictatorship. And this difference is really significant because this is one of the most important debates in the entire field when it comes to measuring and conceptualizing democracy. Is democracy dichotomous or is it continuous? And we can kind of represent the difference in the following way. On the one hand, Dahl envisions this kind of continuum, this spectrum, if you will, where there might be many, many stages in between a full democracy and a full dictatorship. And that continuum takes on all different degrees or shades of democracy and dictatorship. And there may be many, many places in between those pure types on either end. The dichotomous conceptualization is very different. Instead, it views the 2 ends as really being 2 polar opposites and 2 ideal types. It's either a dictatorship or a democracy. And we might imagine that there are variations within each of those types, but the measure itself is not that sensitive to those differences. It really just distinguishes between dictatorship and democracy. And so before we continue, and before I incorporate your input, I want to flesh out a little bit why this matters so much, this distinction between dichotomous and continuous. It's really important because it depends on whether we view democracy as some sort of bounded whole that has essential characteristics that must be met, or if democracies need not have certain characteristics but still be somewhat democratic. It really depends on whether we view democracy as a whole, a sort of bundle, or as a set of moving parts, not all of which may move in the same direction. And this distinction matters a great deal because then it influences the way we think about democracy promotion efforts and whether or not regimes are or are not democratic for all sorts of other purposes that might relate to anything from foreign aid to inclusion in international organizations and so on and so forth. And so the stakes are quite great, and how we think about democracy will depend on where we sort of stand and where we sit. And so I want to hear it from you and ask you, what do you think? Is democracy dichotomous? That is to say, is a country either a dictatorship or a democracy, or is it continuous? As to say, there are degrees of democracy or there are degrees of dictatorship. Any thoughts?
I guess could be both because sometimes is have balance and other times not. Depend of the time, depend of the people that are in the power also.
Okay, so maybe it's both, and it might depend on different circumstances from time to time. Let's elaborate and go further with this. Are there other ideas, or can we think of other perspectives?
I would have to view it more as a continuous variable or a continuous factor. If you look at the United States, I mean, we regard it as wholly democratic, but there are circumstances like in terms of allowing the population to vote, a good number of citizens in America don't actually get the opportunity to do that, but we still regard it as a democratic nation. And you look at places like Russia, where it's like largely authoritarian, but you still kind of view it as democratic due to it's a capitalistic system. So I mean, I think there's different levels.
So normally we draw a distinction between the type of economy and the type of political system. And from our perspective, whether Russia is a democracy will depend a lot on whether it has those contested elections and whether there are uncertain, irreversible, and repeatable outcomes. But Alexis, your point is a really good one. And I want to ask you, so for example, in the United States, and to your point, if we gave felons and ex-felons the right to vote in all states where their voting rights are affected, that would make the system more democratic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the idea of DOL is like you're supposed to be able to allow all adults in the population to vote, and there's not supposed to be any exceptions. But legally, we're allowed to restrict the vote and give it to people that are following certain guidelines. And I mean, that's just, it automatically kind of moves away from that idea of like a total democracy or democratic nation, because people aren't allowed to express their vote for who they want to elect as a representative.
Yeah, and I think that the example of ex-felons and felons is one of the best examples of how like the franchise is restricted in ways that relate to Dahl's conceptualization of democracy. We can plainly see that like restricting the right to vote and reducing the pool of eligible voters in that way, it just does make the system less democratic. We might not say that it's not a formal democracy. It clearly still is, but it's less democratic than it would be if we extended those rights to vote to all of those groups who we've taken those votes, those rights away from, including felons and ex-felons. And so that's a good example. The franchise and who can vote and who cannot, it does suggest that there's like a continuous kind of nature here to the whole democratic process, and it can kind of be restricted or expanded in ways that don't undercut the democracy fundamentally, but make it more or less democratic at the same time. And so that's a really good example. Let's hear from some others. Are there other perspectives? Do you think that this is a dichotomous variable or a continuous variable? So Efren, we'll go back here and just take a look. So a dichotomous variable is one that sees democracy as either it's a democracy or a dictatorship. And then a continuous variable would be one that sees democracy in terms of countries being more or less democratic or more or less dictatorial. And so the question then is, from your perspective, do you think that democracy is better conceptualized as a dichotomy or as a continuum? And Alexis was saying that if we think about, for example, like the right to vote or voting rights and the way that they can be restricted in the United States, it suggests that there's sort of maybe a continuum. But there are other perspectives, and we can think about this from a variety of points of view, and all are equally valid. And so I'd like to hear from anyone and everyone about whether you think this is a dichotomous variable we're dealing with or a continuous one.
Can I try giving
Of
it
course, Efren.
So I think this is more as like the first person said. It's both, because I'm thinking of this like as an example of human rights. So the first term, so is it like democracy or dictatorship? For instance, the United States like is like a democracy because human rights are given and it's a basic like right. But in the but in terms of continuous variable, like the government might be opposing it, like for example, like human rights, like even though it says like it like is to represent the people, it might start to slowly like be less democratic in favor of saying like, oh, like these like given rights are not meant for like everyone. I hope that made sense.
It completely makes sense, Efren. And we can think about like in a basic procedural sense, those rights might exist, or we might have a right to them, but maybe in practice, governments can be more or less respectful of those rights. And in that way, there can be kind of a spectrum or a continuum. You know, one example that also comes to mind on the authoritarian side is you know, the difference between the Soviet Union under Stalin and under Gorbachev. Under Stalin, it was a repressive, totalitarian, authoritarian regime. And it was very much an authoritarian regime. It was almost as authoritarian as could be. But Soviet Russia under Gorbachev was clearly one that was in liberalization, it was opening to some degree, and it was far less repressive, and it was far less totalitarian, if at all. And from that perspective, it suggests that dictatorship is on a continuum as well, and that we can think of regimes as in terms of being both more or less democratic and more or less authoritarian. And so there are differences, and there are differences of degree in the world, but the argument on the dichotomous side is compelling as well, which is that, look, there are certain essential characteristics that must obtain for a democracy to be a democracy. You know, from the perspective of the democracy dictatorship index, those include, for instance, a contested election, the winner of the election taking office, the chief executive being selected through electoral means, and some of those other basic objective characteristics. We can think of different ways that democracy could be both dichotomous and continuous, and we can think of different ways that dictatorship can be both dichotomous and continuous. And so the lesson here is that there are multiple ways of thinking about this, and we can think critically about these different perspectives in useful ways. What about police brutality and the white militias who are justified under the flag of freedom? Well, the question of the ways that governments might incite or mobilize racist violence is certainly relevant, right? Because as we'll see, um, rights and freedoms and political rights and civil liberties matter a great deal to whether a regime is democratic from the point of view of the Freedom House measure, which we'll discuss. And so those are questions that relate to rights and freedoms that are essential to democracy, and whether those kinds of rights and freedoms are abridged by the incitement of racial violence, that's not in question. It just maybe becomes a question of how much does that undermine democracy, and in what ways does that compromise democracy? And so these are all issues that we'll address going forward in the rest of this lecture today. And we'll begin doing that by addressing the next measure, and this is the POLI 4 score. Now, whereas the democracy dictatorship measure is really a dichotomous measure that treats democracy and dictatorship as two polar types, the POLI 4 score is more continuous. It looks at a series of institutional characteristics, and it determines the degree of democracy in a country. And so these include like the nature of executive recruitment, executive constraints, political participation. Much like democracy dictatorship, it's largely procedural in its kind of vantage point. And that again means that it focuses on processes and institutional characteristics more so than outcomes. Now, the actual data set that we use has data from 1800 to 2017. And the countries are categorized from -10 or full autocracies to +10 full democracies. And countries will fall somewhere between -10 and +10. And where they fall determines whether they are democracies or hybrid regimes or dictatorships. And so -10 to -6 is a full autocracy. 6 to 6 is -6 to +6 is a hybrid regime, or sort of like a semi-authoritarian regime. And then +6 to +10 is a full democracy. And these different sort of spaces in the spectrum correspond to different actual regimes in the world. And so we can categorize all regimes in the world according to this measure, and they would fall somewhere in those three. And so this is the data set through 2017, and it shows you that there's been a meteoric rise in the number of democracies that are democracies according to this measure. There's been a decline in autocracies, but there's also been kind of a stabilization of what are called anocracies by this data set. That refers to basically a semi-authoritarian or kind of a hybrid regime. And that's that -6 to +6 area of the spectrum. And the POLI 4 measure is obviously, again, different because it's a continuum, and it views regime in terms of a spectrum and degrees of democraticness or degrees of dictatorshipness, if you will. Can I go back, please? Yes, I can go back to this slide.
Yes.
Yeah. Can I clarify anything?
I'm still kind of confused on like the concept of like the scores, like with how they're actually used in like day-to-day, well, not day-to-day, but maybe like an example.
Yeah, so the truth is that the POLI 4 score has like 17 characteristics. All of those are relatively specific, but they relate to things like, how do you become president? What kinds of restrictions are there on executive power? Can people vote in contested elections? And basically the way it works is whether or not a country ticks off that box will determine whether it goes towards the autocracy score by taking away points, or it goes towards the democratic score by sort of adding points. And the reason that it's kind of confusing, and the reason I haven't gone into a full elaboration here, is because some of the categories are weighted differently than others. And there's not actually a lot of justification for why some of them are weighted more than others. But in general, the categories that matter are essentially these institutional characteristics that relate to institutions like the executive and the legislature, voting rights and stuff like that. But in total, the different characteristics that relate to these issues that we've discussed with Dahl and the different conditions that go with democracy will contribute to the autocracy score by taking away points, or to the democracy score by adding points. And it's the kind of sum, or like the eventual product of all of those that determines what an individual country will get. So the United States, for example, is like an 8 or a 9. And what that means is that for the most part, those different categories add points to the democracy score, as opposed to taking away points and contributing to the autocracy score. And so that's how individual countries get categorized. And there's a lot of dispute about whether or not some of the coding choices are appropriate. And one of the problems with POLI 4 is that because it has this large bundle of characteristics, it becomes more unwieldy. It's a much more complicated measure than, say, democracy dictatorship, which has 4 basic characteristics that are very objective. The POLI 4 score, as a result, is somewhat more difficult to use because of some of those disputes and some of those questions about coding. But it's pretty complicated, but for now, I just want you to focus on the fact that it looks at those institutional characteristics that mainly relate to the Dahl list of minimum conditions. And there's another way we can look at the data. We can look at countries in terms of whether they are full democracies, sort of democracies or not full democracies, the 6 to 10 range, open autocracy, closed autocracy, and then some other categories. This is just another way to look at the data by kind of distinguishing between some different types of regimes. This is in 2011. And this data is a little bit old, but I wasn't able to find a newer map. What it shows you is that there is a lot of variation when we actually use the spectrum as opposed to the dichotomy. Remember that democracy dictatorship would look at these countries in terms of 2 categories, democracies or dictatorships. This measure, by contrast, distinguishes between different degrees of democracy and different degrees of autocracy. And so we see, for instance, that Russia would be looked at as a closed autocracy that falls between -5 and 0. This brings us to the Freedom House score. The Freedom House score is another way of measuring democracy, but it's not actually a measure of democracy. So what it is a measure of freedom. And this is kind of a loosely defined term that basically amounts to political rights and civil liberties. And so these rights include like participation, voting, whether there's competition for office, whether citizens can join political parties, whether they elect their representatives, whether there's accountability of the representatives. The civil rights, the civil liberties relate to free speech and association, rule of law, personal autonomy. The way this measure works is the political rights and civil liberties ratings are averaged, and those averages correspond roughly to 3 categories according to where those averages fall: free, partly free, or not free. And this essentially corresponds to democratic, semi-authoritarian, and authoritarian regimes. Now, the reason that Freedom House is often more difficult to use is because some of these categories are more subjective. And in fact, the way that these scores for individual countries are reached is through the evaluations of country experts who make a judgment about where countries fall in terms of all these different categories. And so whereas the democracy dictatorship in the POLI 4 measures are relatively objective or sort of observable. Some of these civil liberties and political rights categories that fall under the Freedom House score are more difficult to really measure kind of objectively. And there's a lot of disagreement sometimes about whether some of these scores accurately depict a country and whether or not the regime types are actually reliable and valid for those regimes. And so what we get with the Freedom House measure is we get countries that are free, partly free, or not free. And again, that's democratic, semi-authoritarian, and authoritarian. And if we went with, for example, the case of Russia, you'd find that they get a score of about 20 out of 100 for rights and liberties. And that score of 20 out of 100 makes it very much an authoritarian regime because it falls within that first third, that low third. A full 100 would be an entirely free country. A 0 out of 100 would be an entirely unfree country. And again, we've used our Russia example to kind of distinguish, and so that we can see how that works. The Freedom House score is different than the democracy dictatorship in the POLI V score because the Freedom House score is really more of a substantive measure. It's a conceptualization that is substantive in its focus on outcomes, things like accountability, for example, autonomy and the extent to which rights are exercised. These are outcomes. These are things that are going to be the products of those democratic institutions, like constraints on the executive, contested elections, etc. These kinds of outcomes are substantive outcomes, and that's what makes them more in line with the substantive approach to defining democracy. Now, the obvious difference then is that we would use the Freedom House score if we're trying to figure out, for instance, maybe if different types of regimes are better or worse at protecting human rights. Maybe we would use the Freedom House score if we're interested in figuring out, well, what kinds of democracies are best at promoting widespread participation through voting, etc. Those are all examples of questions we could ask. But if we're interested, for example, in whether or not economic development affects the prospects for democratization, well, we would probably want to use the democracy dictatorship measure because it's simpler and it draws a clear distinction between the two types of regimes. And we can just identify whether or not countries that are developed are or are not democratic. And so then the type of measure that we use really depends on the kind of question that we're asking. And to take this point further, the reason that the Freedom in the World and the Freedom House score might not always be useful as a measure for our independent variable is because oftentimes what we try to measure as an outcome will be already contained in the independent variable, in the Freedom House score itself. So for instance, if we're trying to figure out, well, what kinds of regimes are better at reducing corruption, we can't use the Freedom House score as the measure for our independent variable because corruption is part of the measure itself. And so that would be a tautology. That would be a circular line of reasoning that would connect the independent and the dependent variables. We would want to use the democracy dictatorship, the dichotomous measure, or maybe the POLI 4 measure instead of the Freedom House measure if we're trying to figure out the impact on corruption. So we have some choices then between different types of measures. And the choices that we make are going to depend a lot on the kinds of questions that we ask. And I want you to think about the strengths and the weaknesses of the different measures and why we might use one over the other. Before we continue with our discussion and before we talk about the different causes of democratization and then eventually types of transitions, I want to step back for just a moment and ask an important question, which is, what do we want out of democracy? The truth is, as we already established, democracy is no magic bullet. We ask questions about whether democracy reduces corruption or does a better job protecting human rights because those are questions that aren't necessarily foretold. Democracy makes no guarantee. And in fact, from the minimal procedural perspective, thank you so much. From the minimal or the procedural perspective, it's really just a set of institutions or a set of processes or rules that don't guarantee any certain outcome. But if we think about what we actually want from those institutions and what we expect or maybe we desire from them, we can think of a few important considerations. In the first place, we want meaningful elections. That is to say, elections that give us real choices between real alternatives and that produce outcomes that really represent our interests and what the majority votes for. These meaningful elections need to be elections with integrity and that help to depict our preferences and connect us to the government. If those elections are not meaningful and elites don't represent us, well, not only do we not have meaningful elections, but we don't have meaningful representation. And this connects to the second point, which is fair representation. We want a democratic system to sort of represent us in a fair way and depict our preferences and our interests in a fair way. That is, we want majority rights, minority rights, but majority rule. We want a system that actually helps to channel our participation and connect us to government in a way that is fair and that is just. And this connects to the third point, which is accountability. When we talk about accountability, what we mean is our ability to check government or elected actors. And vertical accountability is when voters use elections to punish governments who they no longer support or approve of, or maybe your congressperson or whoever it is who you're voting for or voting against. Horizontal accountability is when government institutions themselves check or hold accountable other institutions. And so, for instance, when the Supreme Court reviews legislation or an executive order, or when the executive rejects a legislative proposal supported on and agreed to by the Senate and the House of Representatives in the United States. These different types of accountability between voters and elected officials and between institutions of government, these different forms of accountability matter a great deal because only if these elected officials and institutions are accountable to us can we truly say that they are representing us and that they are acting on our behalf. And so accountability is an important thing that we want from democracy. But I want you to also notice that Freedom House includes accountability in its definition of democracy, in its conceptualization. And the reason that that's important to note is that, again, it's a substantive definition. And so if we're trying to figure out if democracies do actually produce accountability, we can't use the Freedom House measure. We'd have to use a more procedural measure, one that is simpler and more objective and doesn't focus on outcomes. And then finally, hovering over this entire discussion is our desire for majority rule and minority rights. We want a system that isn't just fair and meaningful and accountable, but one that actually represents the will of the majority and doesn't privilege or advantage a minority over the majority. A key example is South Africa under apartheid. That's a country in a time period where the enormous Black majority did not rule. It had no rights at all. And in fact, it was a tiny white minority that ruled. Clearly not an example of a democracy. And what we want from a democracy is not just a correction of that imbalance, but a proper role for majority rule and the support of minority rights. And so the situation would have been reversed in South Africa had it been a democracy, or had it been a system that produced an outcome that we would associate with democracy, or we would call democratic. But again, I'd like to remind you that questions of minority rights and some of these outcomes that we hope for are often part of the Freedom House definition. And so when we think about the measures that we use, think carefully about your research question and think about what you're actually trying to analyze the outcomes of before you choose a measure. Now, I'd like to hear from you before we continue. Is there anything you would add to this list? What else do we want out of a democracy besides meaningful elections, fair representation, accountability, and a balance of interests between majority rule and minority rights? Efren says, could reform be a possibility? Yeah, that's an interesting point, Efren. We want a system that is able to be reformed, right? We want a system that is responsive and sensitive to changes in society. And I'm actually so glad that you would mention that, Efren, because there's a lot being written about what we call policy drift and whether or not systems are reformable and whether or not there's a responsiveness in the relationship between elected officials and institutions and voters. And some systems are not reformable. They literally appear to be resistant to change. And what that means more fundamentally is that they are not responsive systems. They are not responsive democracies. And so what I would add to this list based on Efren's input here is responsiveness. And this is something that I think might be as important as these other four. Christiana says the Electoral College voting on behalf of the majority vote. So Christiana, do you think as an institution, does the Electoral College support majority rule and minority rights, or does it support minority rule and majority rights? And Christiana, you can take that question, but that's a question that anyone could answer. That's one example of an institution, a democratic institution or a putatively democratic institution, the Electoral College.
I think it's kind of, I guess, like, I mean, it goes like on a person by person basis because some of them do like abide by the majority and like on voting on behalf of the majority rule, but then some will take the opposite direction and vote differently. So I think it kind of depends on like, I don't think I could really speak on them as like, I don't think I could classify them as a whole, but I think it's more of a how each, like it's in each, like every person is different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair take. Let me ask you further. Do you think that the Electoral College is an example of fair representation?
Not all the time, no.
So what are some of the sources of the unfairness in the representation? And Christiana, you can take this and anyone can.
Well, when they don't vote according to the majority, like I think it was with, I mean, with this past election, Hillary had the popular vote, but I mean, obviously it didn't turn out, I mean, Trump won the electoral vote, so I kind of feel like it could minimize our voices. And I think the thing that's like very, like what we value as a democracy is our voices being heard.
Yeah, and so let me take this a little further. So the Electoral College is not an example of fair representation. It undercounts large states and it overcounts small states. So for example, I'm from Nebraska. Nebraska has 5 electoral votes. California has 55. Nebraska has far more electoral votes given how small it is than California has given how large it is. California had all the electoral votes that it should have according to that formula. It would have like, I think 2 or 3 times as many electoral votes. And this is similar in states like New York, which are also very large. The reason the Electoral College was set up that way was because they wanted to protect minority rights. But in effect, what often happens is the Electoral College produces outcomes that are somewhat undemocratic because they tend to elevate minority opinions over the majority. And so this is how we get, for instance, Hillary winning by 3 million votes, and the candidacy who had fewer votes winning the actual presidency because of the Electoral College. The Electoral College does not correspond to the popular vote. There are many more voters in places like California and New York. Um, and of course, swing states become very important and can become prioritized, and there may not be equal voice in the way that Christiana pointed out, and that Jake points out as well. And so Alejandra points out that the two-party system. Alejandra, do you think the two-party system promotes democracy, or do you think that it works against democracy?
I think that it works against it because we obviously know that the majority, like the bigger parties, are the ones that are gonna end up winning most of the time. So most people just go and align with the one that mostly relates to them, but not completely.
Yeah, so Alejandra's making a really important point here, which is that two-party systems, which often arise in majoritarian electoral systems where minorities are denied representation within individual districts, these two-party systems can often really radically reduce our choices, and they can kind of crowd out alternatives that may be preferable to many, many voters. And so maybe what we can add to this list, in addition to responsiveness, is we can add a proportional representation or proportional rule, and maybe a system that would give representation to minorities within districts and not give the entire constituency to the winner of the plurality. And so I know that there's a lot of language here that might be unclear, but we're going to distinguish more forcefully between majoritarianism and proportional representation later in the course when we take a look at different types of democratic institutions. And so I think that point about the two-party system, if we connect it to the electoral system in the way that the electoral system shapes the parties that can be viable politically, I think that's a really good point because it radically reduces our choices. And if it's about people voting and making choices, well, any system that reduces their choices may be less democratic than one that would expand their choices. And so these are all considerations that relate to this discussion. Rady says, with the current elections, most people feel like two candidates aren't enough options. I also agree with this. Yeah, so when we have only two parties, we only have two viable candidates. And what that means in turn is that, again, we don't have that set of options or alternatives that might create more competition between them or give us more say, or really introduce the possibility of real reform, which was mentioned a moment ago, and we connected to the issue of responsiveness. Jakes had said votes in swing states are prioritized and ultimately have more of a say in some cases. Campaigning is focused in these areas. Yeah, there's a loudspeaker given to a very small group of people in a few states. States that are on the whole are often a little bit overrepresented because of the Electoral College, or at least are, compared to California, better represented. Alexis says, if we were to change the Electoral College and make states not vote by winner take all and instead voted in proportion to the number of votes per candidate, would that be fair representation of balance of interest, or would it just band-aid the issue? Alexis, great question. I think that it would help us to maybe begin to approach fairer representation. And the reason is because if we're able to vote for who we like, and if who we like gets the proportion of the vote that they received, and then seats are divided based upon those proportions, that would mean that we could have 2 or 3 or 4 more candidates per district. And that would mean that there would be a much wider spectrum of organized groups and interests. And that would help to create a foundation for a more aggressive entry into politics for maybe socialist or green or other parties that could be viable under a different electoral system. But on the other hand, we might argue that it could just band-aid the issue if some of these stronger parties are still able to maintain pluralities in districts and keep the upper hand. But I think that even if they kept the upper hand, so to speak, I think that introducing proportional representation and expanding representation and expanding seats based on proportion in districts, that would at the very least help to kind of diffuse or kind of water down some of the influence of those traditional parties. I'm optimistic that that kind of an electoral change could be positive if the objective is to expand representation. The only way to know is to bring it about, but obviously that would be an incredibly difficult reform for reasons that are obvious. We would be trampling on very powerful interests who benefit from the status quo. But this takes us back to the other issue, which is responsiveness and whether the system is amenable to reform. But Christiana says that I think two candidates is a good thing. And this is another perspective that's valid. It's the idea that, look, why do you need more than two candidates? Why can't we focus on the competition between those two candidates and put pressure on those two parties to outperform the other and to cater to the largest possible set of potential voters? This is a perspective that thinks of the approach as being one of creating the largest possible coalition in kind of facilitating consensus within the largest possible coalition. But what I would add is that unless we have institutions that are themselves fair in their representation and their support of majority rule, it can be very easy for minorities, and I don't mean racial and other minorities, I mean political minorities, to monopolize power and to rule. And this is, I think, sometimes the concern with the Electoral College and with the Senate, which also overrepresents rural interests. I think that it's a package of institutions and a package of arrangements that has to go hand in hand to promote representation and to promote fair balance of interests in meaningful elections. And Christiana, but the point though is that even if third-party candidates don't win, it's because we have majoritarian institutions which deny representation to candidates that don't win the plurality in a district. And so what that means is that third-party candidates don't have a chance because voters believe that their vote will be wasted if they don't vote for the two parties that are the most competitive. And so what we're saying is that the electoral system itself might be the cause of the poor performance of third-party candidates. It may be the case that a change in the electoral system, as Alex has kind of suggested, that could help to support wider representation in more competitive third parties. But we're really getting into the kind of all of the possibilities here, and the point is that these are difficult outcomes to bring about because of the establishment of these political interests. Jake says there's not supposed to be any guarantees in a democratic election, yet we know one of the two major party candidates is basically every election is guaranteed to win. Yeah, and what's interesting is that seems to violate uncertainty, right? In like a more limited sense, that seems to violate the principle of uncertainty, which says that we shouldn't know ahead of time who will win. But when the electoral system seems to so radically restrict the number of viable options, it really makes it quite easy to anticipate who will and who will not be in office, at least if we think of the two candidates who might be the most competitive. Alejandra says, winner takes all elections make the two-party system. Yeah, I can see that you all have really boned up on that, and you know that already, and that's great to see. Okay, so we're going to move on and begin discussing the causes of democratization. I want to add Jake's quote. There was a quote, I forgot where it came from, but it was something like, any dictator would be jealous of American democracy. Yes, I think that is a fair assessment. What are the domestic and international causes of democratization? Now that we've discussed what democracy is, its historical foundations, how we conceptualize and measure it, question becomes, what are the causes of it and how is it brought about? And when we discuss these causes, we begin thinking about things like class conflicts and economic development, civic values, the type of economy, literacy rates, participation in parties. This is a really old graphic, but these different variables listed here do relate to some of the key causes of democratization according to the literature and according to our understanding. And as we move forward, you'll see these reappear from time to time, and you'll see them figure prominently in our assessment of the evidence that we'll eventually undertake here in a moment. But the first cause of democratization really operates at the domestic level, and that is inside countries. And this is what's been called civic culture. The idea is that if you want democracy, you've got to create a democratic culture, and you've got to create Democrats, not large D, not big D Democrats, but small d Democrats. And these small d Democrats, or people with civic culture, are supposed to have 4 characteristics. They're supposed to be highly engaged in politics and civic affairs. They're supposed to believe in political equality. They're supposed to believe and promote solidarity. They're supposed to believe in tolerance. These are the characteristics that go hand in hand with the civic culture. And the logic is very intuitive, but in some ways it borders on tautological because it borders dangerously close to kind of merging what's being explained and what's doing the explaining. Because we can imagine that democracy itself would produce civic culture. And so how the civic culture comes before the democracy is sometimes the question. But nevertheless, this is one perspective, and civic culture is clearly important in a lot of places, and we can see it being kind of a bedrock for the persistence of democracy in particular. The second set of domestic causes relates to the economy and economic factors. And the basic argument is that economic development may cause democratization. The best example comes from Western Europe in the 19th century, and this is where the theory largely got its wings, the idea that development and growth become essential to democratization. There are 2 causal mechanisms that have been put forward for what connects development and democracy. On the one hand, there's modernization, which was popularized by Seymour Martin Lipset, and then there was class conflicts. And there are some different arguments about which classes matter, but in general, it's the idea that changes in the class structure bring about class conflicts that result in democratic settlements. And Lipset's thesis is maybe the most interesting one. He talks about what's called modernization and goes hand in hand with modernization theory. And Lipset envisions the process taking place like this. Gains in industrialization and a transformation in the economy from agriculture to manufacturing and services set off urbanization and the movement of peasants into the cities, increases in education and literacy, and the expansion of the middle class. Education plays a really important role. Education is a result of economic development, according to Lipset, and education makes the poor more likely to accept democracy and reject extremism. It makes democracy a less threatening possibility for the wealthy. And the middle class gains in size with economic development. Now, the middle class is really, really important because it becomes the main agent of democratization. If there's a single class that helps to exert democratizing pressure, it's the middle class, because the middle class is large and moderate and helps to sort of limit the excesses of the wealthy and the elite, who themselves are becoming more amenable to democracy because of education and because of how education is changing the poor as well. Class conflicts are an important component of the theory. It's that other causal mechanism. And class conflicts really relate to the emergence of middle and working classes in demands for better conditions and demands for guarantees from the state. So this has been depicted in both literature as well as in the academic debate and democratization studies. You might think about, for example, Hard Times by Charles Dickens, a book about the working class. And The Pressure That Working Classes Exert for Political Change, Germinal by Emile Zola. Both of these are examples of the changes in the class structure that development produces and how those changes have political consequences, mainly in demands for better working conditions, inclusion in politics, the expansion of the right to vote. This is the second mechanism in the development theory. Yes, I can go back. Sorry, everyone. I have a little bit to get over, and I don't normally do this, but we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we cover some of the essential material here. I can clarify anything as well, Alejandra.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. Chartism is another example of class conflicts. Chartism was a sort of working class male suffrage movement in England in the mid 19th century. This is an example of a kind of struggle to expand access to the right to vote. And obviously it was male suffrage, and this is an example of how political participation often begins in a limited sense for certain groups. But it's another example of how class conflicts can help to connect economic development and democratization, and how development produces changes in the class structure that can in turn create pressures for democratic reforms and the deepening of democracy. And so we can see these examples, and we can think of a lot of different supporting cases. In Western Europe in general is really the most persuasive set of cases and examples, but there are several outliers. And one of them is Germany. And Germany's situation is important because in Germany, development took place in the 19th century, the modernization that Lipset talked about. And that came way, way before the democratic transition after 1918. And so the timing does not add up. The timing of the democratic transition is at odds with the timing of the modernization. But it is the case that recent democratic transitions in South Korea, Taiwan, and South Africa have been cited to support the thesis. And in South Korea in particular, which we'll look at in a moment, there's a lot of support for the theory because of the timing of industrialization and the timing of the transition in 1987. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the data on a large scale. This is 1985 data. This is arraying countries as proportions of democratic countries at different income levels. And so what we have is those countries that are richer at the time had basically a per capita income of $8,000 per person. Poorer countries at the time are on the other end with somewhere between 0 and 2,000. And in the middle are all these other ones. And what you see is that as countries get richer, a larger and larger proportion of those countries at different income levels are democratic, and to the point where the richest countries are almost entirely democratic. And this is a pretty robust, pretty linear pattern. This suggests that there's something systematic going on. We can take a look at individual cases that deviate from this expectation, and there are some. But what this shows us is that countries at different income levels seem to have different proportions of them being democratic. And that's, again, supporting the theory. Let's take a look at two cases and look at them more closely. We talked about South Korea. South Korea is a good example because they democratized in 1987, and this took place right in the midst of a process of rapid industrialization that had helped to increase education levels and had enlarged the middle class. When we look at South Korea and North Korea, it's what we would call a most similar systems design, as you know, because they're very similar but they have a different outcome. And in North Korea, no industrialization took place and no economic growth took place. And again, if we're using income level as measured by per capita income, GDP per capita, what we find is that there's a very significant difference between South Korea and North Korea, both in growth, economic development, and in the actual regime outcome. North Korea remained a dictatorship, South Korea democratized. And so this is some of the most compelling case evidence. But the situation in South Korea helps to explain the process and helps to clarify the kind of theoretical logic. So in South Korea, the country had a very repressive military regime between World War II and the late 1980s. And this was a military regime that, while it was repressive, was also very aggressive in trying to industrialize the country and set off processes of development. And they did so through state-led development projects. In the 1970s and the 1980s, these projects began to enlarge the middle class. They increased literacy levels and education levels, and they created the foundations, according to modernization theory, for a democratic transition or democratization. And that took place in June 1987. That was when student-led protest movements that relied a lot on the mobilization of the new middle class led to the first democratic elections. And so this is a story in South Korea that seems to illustrate both the steps in the process and the actors involved, the middle classes, the changes in the class structure, changes in education and literacy, and the way in which this creates the foundations for mobilizing and exerting pressure against the continuation of the authoritarian regime. Now, the third domestic cause of democratization is really the role of the military. The military is an important actor because it's the one actor who has the capacity to resist or prevent democratization. It's because they have a monopoly on violence, they have the guns, and ultimately, in the end, political power is really delivered at the barrel of a gun, more so than the stroke of a pen. But there's a key distinction among militaries around the world. Some militaries believe they are independent of any civilian authority. That's type 1. Others accept a role that is subordinate to civilian authorities. That's type 2. Now, type 2 militaries can facilitate democratization. And the example that we'll discuss is Portugal. Before we continue, I want to really emphasize this. It's not just that militaries can resist democratization. They can also bring it about. For the same reason that they can resist it, they can bring it about because they have the capacity and the political power, the raw political power, to facilitate democratization where it otherwise might not be brought about. And so the example of Portugal is the most instructive example of all. And this is, again, an example of a type 2 military. And so the Portuguese case takes us back to the period between 1933 and 1975 when the Estado Novo, the dictatorship, ruled ruthlessly and mercilessly in that country. In the early 1970s, the dictatorship and the state carried out a very unpopular colonial war to try to hold on to possessions in Africa. And in the mid-1970s, this unpopular colonial war began to give way to a deep social and economic crisis that was so deep that it began to generate divisions within the regime. And the authoritarian elite began to turn against one another and began to disagree about the desirability of continuing in power. And this set of divisions within the regime brought about by these crises created a context and a void that the military stepped into. The military overthrew the regime and helped to restore democracy. And the movement that helped to restore democracy was a movement within the military itself. It wasn't the entire military, but it was a movement, and that movement is pictured here. This is an example of a type 2 military, one that can facilitate democratization where otherwise it might not occur. I want to emphasize to you that in this moment, despite the depth of the crisis and the divisions within the regime, there wasn't enough capacity within those elites within the regime who wanted to step down from power to bring about the transition on their own. That was why it became essential for the military to carry out the process and to essentially impose a democratic transition. Now, the story is more complicated in all its detail. In the military, for example, did reserve certain institutional guarantees and rights and guarantees through the transition that did limit the capacity of the democratic regime to function. But the point remains that it was the military that facilitated the transition. There are also some international causes of democratization, and these include everything from war to decolonization, the end of the Cold War, changes in the Catholic Church, and then also the European Union and pressures exerted by the European Union on individual countries to reform their political systems in line with European standards. All of these are examples of factors that lie outside of national polities and that could influence change within those polities. We can talk about waves of democratization as well. And these waves of democratization are basically groups of democratic transitions that happen around the same time and that appear to influence one another. These democratization waves can be traced as far back as the period between 1825 and 1925, when the first wave took place. The second wave took place between 1945 and 1960. The third wave took place between 1974 and 1995. And all of these represented sort of groups of transitions. And these waves left behind fewer authoritarian regimes and created far more democracies. And the different causes of these waves are really quite numerous. So the end of the Cold War was one at the end of the 1990s. That this coincided with the third wave's most intense period. The diffusion of transnational commitments to democracy and the promotion of democracy by world powers has often been cited as a cause of the diffusion of ideas between countries that can help to support waves of democratization. And then there's also the diffusion of practices and events in policy changes. And so in Latin America, for example, a lot of countries learned from each other and seemed to follow suit with democratic transitions when their neighbors exhibited or illustrated the process first. And this often takes place when countries have a lot of historical or cultural shared kind of lineage or a lot in common. Kevin's asking, are we in the third reverse wave right now? This is a question that we addressed in my Transitions to Democracy class. We evaluated that question. What we determined is that we're not quite in a third reverse wave, but we're getting extremely close, and it's almost too close for comfort. What happens next is really up in the air. We're kind of staring off into the abyss at this point, Kevin. And so whether a third reverse wave begins will depend upon a few more democratic regimes failing in the next few years. But if a few more do, we can probably say that a third reverse wave is underway, because it's already been the case that about 10 to 15 countries have failed. 10 to 15 democratic regimes have failed in the last 5 to 10 years. And prior reverse waves witnessed the failure of between 20 and 30. And so if we see 5 or 10 more failures in transitions from democratic to authoritarian rule, we'll probably be in a reverse wave of democracy, the fourth reverse wave, or the third reverse wave, excuse me. Good question, Kevin. So we've got one more unit here, and I'm going to tell you that regretfully we have 4 minutes left, and I'm worried that we don't have the time to address these last issues. And that's okay, that's fine, because we had such good discussions today that much of our time we devoted to discussing the issues, and that's what I always want to do. But let's try to cover as much as we can in the time that we have left. And then I encourage you to please review the slides that I post immediately, and review those and read them, because it can substitute for what I ordinarily would deliver in the rest of the lecture. A reverse wave, it's not a restructuring. A reverse wave is basically a pattern of transitions from democratic to authoritarian rule, or what we would call regime failures, democratic regime failures, when countries revert to authoritarian rule, and when democracy fails in those countries. So after discussing the causes of democratization, we've got to address the concept of a democratic transition itself, which is the actual interval between one political regime and another. Now, these transitions are delimited on one side by the launching of a process of dissolution of the authoritarian regime, and on the other side by the installation of some form of democracy. And the installation of some form of democracy, as you know, depends upon the election and the taking power of a freely and fairly elected leader. And this process of turning power over to democratic leaders is the defining characteristic of a democratic transition. But these transitions are not created equal. The truth is that we distinguish between different types of transitions. There are transitions through rupture, and there are transitions through transaction. So a transition through rupture is a very rapid transition that follows some exceptional event. And this can take place as a result of a regime defeat. So for example, Italy, Germany, and Japan were defeated in World War II and underwent democratic transitions as a result of conditions imposed on them. Argentina in 1982 and 83 was defeated in the Falklands War and underwent a democratic transition when the military handed over power and called for elections shortly thereafter. In Portugal in 1975, the economic crisis and the protracted war created those divisions within the regime and those popular crises that helped to fell the regime and support a military overthrow and imposition of democracy. In Greece, there was the fiasco with Cyprus in 1974. Transitions through popular uprising are also one type of transition through rupture. And so we can think, for example, about Eastern Europe in 1989, 1990, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, for instance, popular uprising, popular mobilization. Also, the case of Tunisia in 2011 is another example of a transition through popular uprising, one type of transition through rupture. Now, Tunisia was unique in the Arab Spring because it was one of the few, if not the only, successful democratic transitions or successful revolutions during the Arab Spring. In Portugal, the transition through regime defeat looked like this: popular uprisings and popular mobilization that were themselves driven by these crises and the discontent with the regime. The example of Argentina is also a noteworthy example. As I mentioned, Argentina had a very repressive military regime. In 1982, the economy was in free fall and the military was losing legitimacy. And they sought a distraction to try to re-legitimate themselves and sort of prop up their rule. And the junta invaded the Falklands Islands, which were held by, of course, England. And they lost the ensuing war very quickly, and it was a rapid defeat. And the junta, in response, called for democratic elections in 1983. And this sequence of events helps to illustrate the nature of a transition through regime defeat so vividly, precisely because the regime itself tried to start a war for the purpose of giving itself a reason to stay in power, but lost so mercilessly that they had to immediately scurry back to the barracks. And so this type of transition is the most interesting one from the perspective of the kind of spectacle. But the transition through negotiation, the transition through bargaining, the other type is also interesting and important because of the nature of the process and the timing of the process. Christiana, what part are you asking about?
The part that said the transition is the interval between one political regime. The quote, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, so it's that period of time where in between when authoritarian rulers decide that they will hand over power to democratically elected successors, and then the actual moment when those democratically elected successors are handed power. And so it's really a period of time in between one regime and another. And that period of time is characterized by the transition processes that take place between the outgoing authoritarian elite and the new incoming democratically elected elite. So everyone, we're out of time and I don't want to hold you. And I know that many of you may have other classes to go to. But I think that because it might be useful to you, I'm going to continue to finish the lecture. And I've got just a few slides left. You can go if you need to, but I'll finish this and I'll record this. And then that way we'll have the complete lecture and you can go back to it and we can cover all the content that's relevant to the unit. But this will be available to you and I'll post this as a video and the slides will be posted as well. Of course, if you want to stick around and make comments or ask questions when I'm done in a few minutes, you can do that. I don't anticipate that it'll take any more than 5 or 6 minutes. But let me just go ahead and finish the lecture for your sake and we'll just continue. So here's the Falklands Islands. This is what was at stake when the Argentine military regime invaded and challenged the United Kingdom's claim to the Falklands Islands. This is just a set of islands where mostly British nationals live, and it's long been disputed, but it's firmly in British hands, and it was definitely an effort by the Argentine military to kind of legitimate its rule and create a purpose for itself beyond the period that it was in power. So the other type of transition is a transition through transaction. And this is a negotiated process between some actors in the authoritarian regime and some actors in the opposition or the civil society. And this is a very different type of transaction because it's really a bargain or a negotiation. It's not a transition through some sudden event that displaces or weakens the outgoing authoritarian elite. It's really a process that gives that authoritarian elite the upper hand and requires the opposition to sort of cater to them and concede to them certain guarantees that will help to get them out of power, but will give them influence in the new regime. And so this is a really long process. It's a series of negotiations or bargains that takes place. And what it's characterized by above all is the way in which the authoritarian elite face mounting costs to remaining in power and falling costs to democratizing. And even if they're able to retain a lot of influence and bargain their way to a strong position in the new democratic regime, it's always the case that there is some impetus or some reason that it's becoming more difficult for them to maintain power, either because they're losing political support or because the circumstances surrounding the rule are beginning to deteriorate. It's always the case that maintaining power becomes more costly and democratizing becomes less costly, comparatively so, even though the process takes several years. But that process really is characterized by 4 stages. And the first stage involves political liberalization and the renaissance of civil society. This is when restrictions on parties are lifted, restrictions on political organizing are lifted, exiles are allowed to return home, various types of changes that are designed to kind of permit the opening of civil society. We call this political liberalization. The second stage is when the regime and the opposition split between hardliners and softliners. Both the authoritarian elite and the civil society opposition to the authoritarian elite have 2 factions. Those factions are hardliners on the one hand. The hardliners in the regime don't want to give up power at all. The hardliners in the opposition don't want to negotiate with the regime. But both sides, the regime and the opposition, are also composed of softliners. The softliners disagree with the hardliners. The softliners want to negotiate. So the regime elite, the softliners, are willing to negotiate with the opposition. The opposition softliners are willing to negotiate with the regime. The third stage is the negotiation between these 2 sides of softliners. The regime softliners and the opposition softliners come together and begin to bargain and negotiate the terms of this transition to democracy. The fourth stage is what we call a pact, and this is where the 2 sides agree to a new constitution and the founding of elections. And this is the most important moment of all because it kind of institutionalizes the agreement between the 2 sides in the form of a new constitution, and then the founding elections that will kind of create the path to democracy and create the opening in the moment of democratization. Now, what kinds of guarantees are given to those regime elites who are willing to negotiate in exchange for some kind of concession? Well, there are a number of issues that have to be resolved as a part of this bargain and this negotiation. And those relate to human rights issues, in particular, the amnesties that are often granted to the military in exchange for leaving power. They won't be prosecuted for the abuses that they committed while they were in power during the authoritarian regime. The economic issues often relate to creating certain guarantees that will ensure certain budgets or certain kinds of economic institutions or policies in the country under the new democracy. And then there's the issue of resolving the question of the role of the military. The military always wants to retain some influence in the new democracy. And when it's in a position to negotiate its withdrawal, the role of the military becomes a key issue. And there are a variety of guarantees and assurances given to the military to help to preserve its role. And so these guarantees are given by the political elites in the opposition. These are the opposition softliners who are negotiating with the authoritarian elites, those softliners in the authoritarian elites. And those electoral guarantees include like unelected representatives that will help to give the military's allies a majority in the Congress or help to give them some protection against policy changes. Supermajority requirements are often also imposed for the same reason. These are very high thresholds for legislative change. Again, these are designed to preserve or protect certain policies that the military or the elite like. There are certain economic guarantees that are given in the form of military levies that are designed to entitle the military to a share of export revenues, budget floors that are designed to prop up and guarantee a certain military budget or a certain amount of money for the military each year. These are often very high. Then they often are given control of enterprises so that they can extract revenue and so that they can have capital gains and managerial perks and all sorts of benefits in society. These are all the kinds of guarantees that they might get that are economic in addition to electoral, but they're also given certain institutional powers as well. And so they often get veto power in the form of national security councils that can veto the decisions of executives or even the legislature. Sometimes they're given arbiter roles in the Constitution that outline a role for them in the power to intervene in politics legitimately and constitutionally. And they're given human rights amnesties. They're given amnesties so that they're not prosecuted for human rights abuses under the new democratic regime. The truth is that these pacted transitions are designed to produce stability, but the record is actually mixed. And so, for example, in Ecuador, the military obtained institutional guarantees, but still intervened again several times, almost a decade and a half later in the 1990s and the 2000s. It was 1979 in Ecuador when the transition took place. And so in Ecuador and elsewhere, it's not clear that the pacts that are produced by the negotiating parties actually lead to the stability that they anticipate. Now in Latin America, which is the region that has a connection to California and that I know best, most transitions occurred through elite transactions or pacts. And this often took place under military rule or military tutelage. Every country you can think of who often ticks off the list, Ecuador, Peru, Honduras, Bolivia, Uruguay, Brazil, Guatemala, Chile, and Paraguay, these are all countries that were under military rule, and all of these countries experienced transitions through transaction. In those transitions, virtually always involved significant concessions from the opposition to the regime elite in the form of those electoral, economic, and institutional guarantees. And one example is the example of Chile, and this is probably the best known example because of just how powerful the military was and how well represented it was by political parties of the right who it had allied with during the dictatorship. And so the military regime, that dictatorship was very repressive. And in the mid-1980s, a dialogue began between softliners within the regime and then centrist politicians who themselves were softliners within the civil society opposition. And this eventually gave way with the benefit of popular protest and rising popular mobilization against the regime, to a plebiscite in 1988 to determine if General Pinochet, who was the ruling president at the time, would be able to be in power for another term. And 56% of Chileans said no to a new term for General Pinochet. And that set off a transition game between these softliners and these centrist politicians and those softliners within the regime itself. And the assurances that they were provided were both electoral in the form of unelected senators, in the form of supermajority requirements. They got economic benefits in the form of military levies, budget floors, control of enterprises. They also got institutional guarantees in the form of human rights amnesties, veto power, an arbiter role. There were even others that we didn't list off that they were able to obtain. All of those assurances were enshrined in the 1989 constitutional reform. And so what I want to point out to you is that even after General Pinochet lost the plebiscite for a new term, the military was still able to extract important concessions through the 1989 constitutional reform. A year after that election took place, they still obtained all of those benefits. What that means then is that even after they lost the election, they still weren't going to leave power unless they obtained those concessions. This is the essence of a transition through transaction, a negotiated kind of agreement or a bargain that results in assurances given to the outgoing regime elite in exchange for leaving power. Now, this brings us to the last stage of all of the sort of democratization process that begins with democratization, follows up with the transition, and then concludes with what we call consolidation. And this is a set of steps that associate with that kind of third phase. And that phase is characterized by the solidification of democratic institutions in the kind of maturing of democratic institutions. And this is a period characterized first and foremost by avoiding democratic breakdowns. That is, stopping the military from intervening in politics, or ensuring that all political actors obey the rules and play by the democratic rules, so that elected leaders who lose a re-election leave power and turn over power, so that election outcomes are uncertain and repeatable and irreversible, and so on. Step two is avoiding democratic erosion. So keeping presidents and ruling presidents, or keeping executives from committing abuses, abusing their power, avoiding popular disenchantment. That is, keeping citizens from becoming unoptimistic about the future of democracy, or keeping citizens from denying democracy their support, keeping citizens supporting democratic institutions. And then third, deepening democracy. This is characterized by building and fortifying democratic institutions. And so strengthening competitive party systems, strengthening vertical and horizontal accountability, and extending and emboldening the franchise, and widening the radius of participation in politics and who can vote, building democratic institutions and deepening and extending those institutions. These are the steps in democratic consolidation. And this is the last phase in this three-step process. And when you think about democratization, you can then think about where countries are in this process. Are they democratizing? Are they transitioning? Or are they consolidating? And that helps us to distinguish between different country experiences, and helps us to think about democracy in a way that is more nuanced, and that is more sensitive to the way that democracies develop and evolve. And so this does conclude the lecture, everyone. And thank you so much if you stuck around for the rest of it. I'm glad that we were able to finish it up. You're free to go. We are done. I'm going to stop recording now. If you want to ask questions or make comments,